The flash of red and blue lights in my driveway at 7 in the morning was not how I expected to start my Saturday. But there they were, reflecting off the fresh snow that had blanketed our property in northern Minnesota overnight. I pulled on my boots and headed outside, still in my thermal shirt and jeans, wondering what could possibly warrant a police visit. Sheriff Tom Anderson stood next to his patrol car, looking more annoyed than concerned. Behind him, I could see 3 people from the neighborhood standing at the edge of my property line, arms crossed in that self-righteous way that immediately told me everything I needed to know. "Morning, Owen," Tom said, his breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. "Got a complaint about you this morning." "Let me guess," I said, glancing past him at the trio. "The HOA, you know it." Tom shook his head slightly. "They called in saying you were operating an illegal vehicle on protected land and disturbing the peace at ungodly hours." I looked at my snowmobile, parked exactly where I had left it after my early morning ride through the trail system I had spent the last 15 years maintaining. The machine was barely an hour cooled down, and already someone had their panties in a twist about it. "Tom, you know those trails better than anyone except me. You hunt on them every fall." "I do," he acknowledged. "Which is why I am out here at 7 in the morning instead of having my coffee. I figured we should clear this up right quick before it becomes a thing." The woman leading the charge from the HOA was named Barbara, and if there was ever a textbook example of someone who lived to make other people miserable, she was it. She had moved into the development 3 years ago, immediately got herself elected to the HOA board, and had been a thorn in everyone's side ever since. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tight it probably gave her a headache, and her puffy winter coat made her look like an overstuffed marshmallow as she marched toward us. "Officer, I demand you cite this man immediately," she called out before she even reached us. "He has been violating multiple ordinances and destroying protected wetlands with that monstrosity." "Madam, I am the sheriff, not an officer, and I will handle this as I see fit," Tom said, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who had already lost their patience. "Now, Mr. Randall here has some documentation I think you should see." "I do not need to see anything," Barbara huffed. "The HOA bylaws are very clear. No motorized recreational vehicles are to be operated on any common land within our community boundaries. It is in the covenant that everyone signed." I could not help but laugh, which only made her face turn a deeper shade of red. "Barbara, you might want to actually check your property maps before you go throwing around accusations." "I have checked everything thoroughly," she snapped back. "Those trails run right through HOA property, and you have been trespassing and causing damage. We have documentation of you riding that thing at 5 in the morning, waking up the entire neighborhood." "The entire neighborhood?" I raised an eyebrow. "You mean you specifically in your house that you specifically bought right at the edge of the property line, knowing full well there was a trail system there?" Tom held up his hand. "All right, let us all take a breath here. Owen, you got those property deeds handy?" "In my office." "Give me 5 minutes." I walked back into my house, which sat on a solid 20 acres at the northern edge of what was now called Pinewood Estates. When my grandfather had owned this land, all 600 acres of it, this had been prime hunting and recreation territory. He had spent decades building and maintaining trails through the woods and around the wetlands, creating one of the best snowmobile and ATV trail systems in Crow Wing County. When he passed 15 years ago, he left me this parcel and the trail easements, but he had sold off portions of the surrounding land over the years to developers. The Pinewood Estates development was the result of one such sale. built on 200 acres that had been cleared and developed into a cookie-cutter suburban neighborhood that somehow thought it belonged in the middle of rural Minnesota. I grabbed the folder containing all my property documents, including the trail easements that were registered with the county, and headed back outside. The crowd had grown. Apparently, Barbara had called for backup, and now 5 members of the HOA board stood in my driveway like they were planning to storm a castle. "Here we go," I said, handing the documents to Tom. Trail easements recorded with the county in 1987, renewed in 2010 when Grandpa passed. The trails run through my property, county land, and yes, through what is now part of the Pinewood development. Tom flipped through the pages, though I knew he was familiar with all of this. He was making a show of it for Barbara's benefit. These look to be in order. Owen here has legal right-of-way through those trails, registered and recognized by the county. "That is impossible," Barbara sputtered. "Our development owns that land." "Your development owns the residential plots," I corrected. "The trails were specifically excluded from those sales." "They are easements, which means they run through the property but are not owned by the development. It is all in the title work that your HOA should have reviewed before you started making accusations." Another board member, a thin man named Gerald who always looked like he had just sucked on a lemon, stepped forward. "Even if that were true, there are still noise ordinances. You cannot be running that thing at all hours." "I ride at 5 in the morning during the winter months," I said. "There is no county noise ordinance before 7 a.m. on weekends, and even if there were, I am on my own property when I start the engine and do not enter what you consider your territory until I am well past your houses." "We can hear you," Barbara insisted. "It wakes up my children." "Your children are in college, Barbara. I have seen them maybe twice in the last 2 years, both times during Christmas break." Tom closed the folder and handed it back to me. "Seems pretty straightforward to me. Mr. Randall has every right to use those trails. They are legal easements, and he is not violating any noise ordinances or other laws." "This is outrageous," Barbara said, her voice rising. "We will be contacting the county attorney about this. There is no way this can be legal." "You are welcome to do that," Tom said pleasantly. "But I am telling you right now, you will be wasting your time and probably some money on legal fees. Those easements have been in place for almost 40 years. They are not going anywhere." The group huddled together, whispering furiously among themselves while Tom and I stood there in the cold. I could see my neighbor from across the street, old Jim Patterson, watching from his window with what I was sure was a grin on his face. He had been dealing with the HOA's nonsense for years before I really became their target. "Owen," Tom said quietly, "you might want to watch yourself with these folks. They seem like the type to cause trouble just for the sake of it." "Oh, I know. This is not the first time Barbara has come after me. Last year she tried to fine me for having a truck parked in my driveway that she deemed unsightly. How did that work out?" I reminded her that my property is not part of the HOA despite being surrounded by it. She was not happy. Tom chuckled. "I bet not." "Well, unless they come up with something actually illegal, they cannot do much. Just keep your documentation handy." The HOA board broke their huddle and Barbara stormed back over, her face now matching the color of her expensive winter coat. "This is not over, Mr. Randall. We will be reviewing every inch of those supposed easements, and if we find even the slightest discrepancy, we will have you in court. You do what you need to do, Barbara, but maybe next time, check your facts before you waste the sheriff's time on a Saturday morning." She opened her mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, she spun on her heel and marched back toward the development, her little entourage following like ducklings behind their mother. Tom watched them go, shaking his head. "Those folks are something else," he muttered. "You would think people would have better things to do than police their neighbors like that." "You would think," I agreed. "Thanks for coming out, Tom. I know this was probably not how you wanted to start your weekend." "Part of the job. Besides, it gave me an excuse to check in on you." "How have you been doing? Has not seen you around town much lately. Been busy with work. The logging company has me running crews all over the county. Plus, I have been trying to keep up with trail maintenance before we really get into the heavy snow season." Tom nodded. "Speaking of which, I am planning a hunting trip next month if this weather holds. Mind if I use the trails to get back to that blind near Miller's Creek?" "You know you are always welcome, Tom. Just shoot me a text so I know someone is back there." After Tom left, I stood in my driveway for a few minutes, watching the sun climb higher in the crystal blue sky. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked over to my snowmobile, running my hand along its side. This machine represented more than just recreation to me. It was a connection to my grandfather, to the countless hours we had spent together maintaining these trails, teaching me about the land and how to respect it while still enjoying it. I could still remember being 8 years old, riding behind him on his old Polaris, learning which paths to take and which to avoid, where the wetlands were too fragile, and where the ground was solid enough to support traffic. He had taught me about conservation, about sustainable use of the land, about being a steward rather than just a user. The trails were his legacy, and I would be damned if some HOA board with inflated egos and too much time on their hands was going to take that away. I went inside and made myself breakfast, trying to put the morning's confrontation out of my mind. But even as I sat there eating my eggs and toast, I knew this was far from over. Barbara was not the type to let things go, especially not when she felt publicly embarrassed. She would come back with something, some new angle or complaint, and I needed to be ready for it. Around noon, my phone rang. It was Jim Patterson from across the street. "Owen, you got a minute?" His gravel voice came through the speaker. "Sure, Jim, what's up?" "Just wanted to give you a heads up. Barbara and her crew are going door to door in the neighborhood, trying to drum up support for some kind of petition against you." "A petition for what?" "From what I heard when she knocked on my door, they want to force the county to revoke your trail easements. Something about them being outdated and not in keeping with the current use of the land." I felt a knot form in my stomach. "They cannot do that. Those easements are ironclad." "I know that, and you know that, but they are telling people that you are destroying protected wetlands and disturbing wildlife habitats, making it sound like you are some kind of environmental menace. That is complete garbage. I have done more for land conservation in this area than their entire development combined." Preaching to the choir, son. But you know how people are. They hear something that sounds official and scary, and they believe it without checking facts. "I just thought you should know what you are up against." "I appreciate it, Jim. Did you sign their petition?" He snorted. "Hell no. I told Barbara exactly where she could stick her petition. But I think I saw at least a dozen people signing it as I watched from my window." After hanging up with Jim, I decided I needed to get ahead of this before it turned into something bigger. I called my lawyer, Mark Stevens, who had handled my grandfather's estate and had been my go-to for any legal issues since. "Owen, good to hear from you," Mark said when he picked up. "What can I do for you?" I explained the situation, from the morning visit by the sheriff to Jim's warning about the petition. Mark listened without interrupting, and I could hear him typing notes on his computer. "Okay," he said when I finished. "First thing, do not worry too much about the petition. They can collect all the signatures they want, but it does not change the legal standing of your easements. Those are recorded property rights, not something that can be voted away by angry neighbors. That is what I thought, but I wanted to make sure. However, Mark continued, you should be prepared for them to make this difficult. If they decide to file a legal challenge, even a frivolous one, it will cost you time and money to defend. Not because you will lose, but because you will have to go through the motions of proving what we already know is true. So what do you recommend? Get ahead of it. I will draft a letter to the HOA board, laying out the legal facts and making it clear that any legal action on their part will be met with a countersuit for harassment. Sometimes, a strongly worded letter from an attorney is enough to make people think twice. Do it. And Mark, pull together all the documentation we have on the trail maintenance and conservation work I have done. If they want to claim I am some kind of environmental villain, I want to be able to prove otherwise. Smart thinking. I will have something for you by Monday. The rest of Saturday passed quietly, but Sunday morning brought a new surprise. I woke up to find a large sign had been erected at the trailhead on my property, right where it met the edge of the development. The sign read, "Private property, no trespassing, violators will be prosecuted," in large red letters. I stood there in my bathrobe and boots, coffee mug in hand, staring at this sign that had definitely not been there when I went to bed. It was planted firmly in the ground, concrete and all, meaning someone had put some serious effort into installing it overnight. The problem was, it was on my property, not theirs. I took several photos with my phone from multiple angles, making sure to capture the GPS coordinates as well. Then I called Tom Anderson again. "They did what now?" Tom said, sounding both tired and amused. "Put up a no trespassing sign on my property, claiming the trail is private. On your property?" "Yep, about 3 feet onto my side of the property line. That is trespassing and vandalism." "Want me to come take a look? If you do not mind. I want this documented properly." Tom arrived about an hour later and we walked out to examine the sign together. He took his own photos and measurements, confirming that the sign was indeed on my property. "This is pretty brazen," he said. "Even for an HOA, you want to press charges?" "Not yet. I want to see if they will remove it voluntarily first, but I want this documented in case things escalate." "Smart. I will file a report. In the meantime, you have every right to remove that sign yourself, seeing as it is on your property." After Tom left, I got my tools and spent the next hour digging up the sign. The concrete base was deeper than I expected, which meant whoever installed it really thought it was staying. I loaded it into the bed of my truck and drove it over to Barbara's house in the development. She answered the door in yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt, clearly not expecting visitors. Her expression went from annoyed to furious when she saw me standing there with her sign. "What are you doing with HOA property?" she demanded. "This is not HOA property. This is garbage that someone illegally installed on my land last night. I am returning it to who I assume is the responsible party. That sign marks the boundary of development property. You have no right to remove it. Barbara, that sign was 3 feet onto my property. I have photos, GPS coordinates, and a police report documenting it. Now, you can take this sign back, or I can press charges for trespassing and vandalism. Your choice." She stared at me, and I could see the calculations happening behind her eyes. Finally, she grabbed the sign from me with both hands, struggling under its weight. "This is harassment," she hissed. "We are well within our rights to protect our property." "Protect your property all you want. Just stay on your side of the property line while you do it." I turned and walked back to my truck, feeling her glare burning into my back the entire way. As I drove home, I could not shake the feeling that this was going to get worse before it got better. Monday morning, I got a call from Mark. I have that letter drafted, he said. But we might have a bigger problem. What now? I did some digging into the HOA bylaws and recent board minutes, which are public record. Looks like they have been planning this for a while. They want to build a new community center and park on land adjacent to the trails, and your easements are apparently interfering with their plans. What do you mean, interfering? The way they have it designed, the trails would cut right through the middle of their proposed park. Instead of redesigning their plans, they are trying to get rid of your easements. Suddenly, everything made more sense. This was not just about noise complaints or property disputes. The HOA had bigger plans and I was standing in their way. Can they do that? I asked. Not legally, no. But they can make it expensive and difficult for you. They might try to claim eminent domain or public necessity. It probably would not work, but the legal battle could drag on for months or even years. So what do I do? We send the letter, establish your position firmly, and then we wait to see their next move. In the meantime, document everything. Every interaction, every complaint, every sign they put up. If this goes to court, we want a clear record of harassment. The letter went out Monday afternoon. By Tuesday morning, I had received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney, demanding I cease all use of the trails pending a full legal review of the easements. I laughed when I read it. They were demanding I stop using my own legal property rights while they tried to figure out a way to take them from me. Mark sent back a response within the hour, essentially telling them to pound sand in the most professional legal language possible. Wednesday brought a new tactic. I came home from work to find the trail access points blocked with chains and locks. Not just at the development entrance, but at 3 other points where the trails crossed what they apparently considered their property. This time, I was less patient. I called Tom Anderson and asked him to meet me at the site. When he arrived and saw the chains, his expression darkened. "This is getting out of hand," he said. "They are actively interfering with your legal property rights now. What can we do about it?" Officially, you can file for a restraining order against the HOA, preventing them from interfering with your easements. Unofficially, you have every right to cut those chains, seeing as they are illegally blocking your access. Let us do both. I want this on record, but I also need to use these trails. We have people who depend on them for access to hunting land and emergency services routes. Tom nodded. I will document everything and start the paperwork for harassment charges. You might want to consider a civil suit as well, for interference with property rights. I spent the next hour cutting chains while Tom photographed everything. By the time we finished, it was getting dark, and I was exhausted from both the physical work and the mental strain of dealing with this constant battle. Thursday morning, I woke up to find my truck had been vandalized. Someone had scratched, stopped the noise into the paint on both sides and slashed 2 of my tires. I called Tom immediately. "This is now criminal activity," he said when he arrived to take the report. "This goes beyond HOA disputes. Someone committed vandalism and property damage." "Do you think it was Barbara or one of the board members?" "I cannot say without evidence, but I will be having some conversations with them today." "Do you have any security cameras?" "No, but I am getting some installed this afternoon." Tom's visit to the HOA board must have rattled them, because I received a phone call that afternoon from Gerald, the vice president of the board. "Mr. Randall, I wanted to reach out and see if we could find a compromise here," he said, his voice overly friendly in a way that immediately made me suspicious. "What kind of compromise?" "Well, the board has been discussing the situation, and we would like to propose buying your trail easements from you. We would offer you fair market value, of course. The easements are not for sale." I understand they have sentimental value, but perhaps if we discussed a number that reflected that value. Gerald, let me be very clear. Those trails represent 40 years of work by my grandfather and 15 years of work by me. They are used by dozens of people in this community for recreation, hunting access, and emergency services. They are not for sale at any price. That is unfortunate. I had hoped we could resolve this amicably. You want to resolve this amicably? Stop harassing me. Stop blocking my access. Stop vandalizing my property. Follow the law, respect my legal rights, and we will have no problems. He was quiet for a moment. I hope you understand that the board is prepared to take whatever legal action is necessary to protect the interests of our community. And I hope you understand that I am prepared to defend my legal rights with every resource I have. I have documentation, legal precedent, and the law on my side. What do you have? He hung up without answering. Friday brought a break in the madness. Mark called with good news. I filed the restraining order this morning, and the judge granted a temporary order pending a full hearing. The HOA is legally prohibited from interfering with your access to the trails or your property in any way. That is great news. It gets better. Their lawyer called me this afternoon. Apparently, they did some actual research into your easements and realized they do not have a legal leg to stand on. They are trying to figure out a way to back down without looking completely incompetent. Good. Maybe now things can get back to normal. Maybe. But Owen, I have to tell you, there is something else going on here. I have been asking around, and I heard from a friend who does real estate law that the development company that built Pinewood is planning a major expansion. They want to add another 300 homes on the land north of your property. The land where most of my trails run. Exactly. Your easements would make that development significantly less valuable. I think the HOA board is being pressured by the developers to get rid of you. This changed everything. This was not just about some annoying neighbors anymore. This was about money, real money, and development companies had a lot more resources to throw at a problem than a small HOA board. What do? I asked. We keep fighting. Your easements are registered and legal. But you need to be prepared for this to get expensive. Development companies do not give up easily when there are millions of dollars at stake. That weekend, I took a long ride through the trail system, needing to clear my head and remind myself why this was worth fighting for. The snow was perfect, the sky was clear, and the forest was peaceful in a way that nowhere else in the world could match. I rode past the wetlands where I had seen my first bald eagle with my grandfather, over the ridge where we used to stop and have lunch, through the pine grove that had somehow survived the logging boom of the early 1900s. Every inch of these trails held memories, but more than that, they represented something important about land use and conservation. My grandfather had not just built trails for fun. He had designed them to minimize environmental impact while maximizing access. He had worked with the county conservation office to identify sensitive areas and route trails around them. He had created a sustainable system that allowed people to enjoy the land without destroying it. And now, some development company wanted to pave it all over and build cookie-cutter houses. When I got back home, there was a car I did not recognize in my driveway. A man in an expensive suit stood next to it, looking cold and out of place in his dress shoes on my snow-covered driveway. "Mr. Randall," he called out as I pulled up. "My name is Richard Hartley. I represent Northland Development Corporation. I was hoping we could talk." I shut off my snowmobile and pulled off my helmet. "About what?" "About your property and the trail easements. I think we can come to an arrangement that would benefit everyone involved." I told the HOA board the easements are not for sale. "Yes, I am aware, But perhaps you have not heard the right offer yet. May we talk inside? It is rather cold out here." Against my better judgment, I agreed. We went into my house, and I made coffee while he sat at my kitchen table, looking around at the rustic decor with barely concealed disdain. "Mr. Randall, I will be direct with you," he said once we sat down. "Northland Development has plans for a major expansion of Pinewood Estates. We are looking at 300 new homes, a shopping center, possibly a school. It is a significant investment in this community. And my trails are in the way. In a manner of speaking, the easements complicate our development plans significantly. We would have to redesign the entire layout, which would reduce the number of homes we could build and impact our return on investment." "Sounds like a you problem, not a me problem," he smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "I am prepared to offer you $2 million for the trail easements and your cooperation in having them dissolved." I nearly choked on my coffee. $2 million was more money than I would probably see in my lifetime. It would change everything. "That is a lot of money," I said carefully. "It is, and it is a one-time offer. You sign the paperwork, we handle all the legal work to dissolve the easements, and you walk away a wealthy man. And what happens to the trails, to the people who use them? We would incorporate some nature trails into the development, walking paths and such." "Not the same thing. People use these trails for snowmobiles, ATVs, hunting access. Your walking paths would not replace that. Mr. Randall, I understand you have an emotional attachment to this land, but you need to look at this practically. The development is happening whether you cooperate or not. We own the surrounding land. We will build around your easements if we have to. It will just be more expensive and more complicated." "Then I guess it will be more expensive and complicated." His smile faded. "You are making a mistake. $2 million is not an offer we will make twice." "Then I guess I only have to turn it down once. Mr. Hartley, those trails are not about money for me. They are about legacy and conservation and keeping this land accessible for people who do not have millions of dollars to throw around. They are about my grandfather's memory and the dozens of families who depend on this access for their livelihood." "How noble," he said, his tone now dripping with sarcasm. "I hope your principles keep you warm when this turns into a very expensive legal battle. Are you threatening me?" "I am informing you of reality. Northland Development has significant resources and excellent legal representation. If you insist on standing in the way of progress, we will go through the proper legal channels to remove that obstacle. Then I guess I will see you in court. Now get out of my house." He stood, adjusted his suit, and walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned back. "One more thing, Mr. Randall. That HOA board you have been fighting with, we have been funding their legal efforts. Every lawyer they hire, every motion they file, that is coming out of our pocket, and we have very deep pockets. Think about that." After he left, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time staring at my coffee. $2 million. It was enough to retire early, travel, do whatever I wanted. But every time I tried to imagine taking that money, I saw my grandfather's face, remembered the hours we spent together on those trails. I called Mark and told him about the offer and the threats. $2 million is a serious offer," Mark said. "But I have to ask, is this really about the money for you?" "No. It is about principle. It is about not letting some corporation buy their way out of having to respect property rights and conservation easements. Then we fight. But Owen, I need you to understand what you are up against. Northland Development is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. They have teams of lawyers and unlimited resources. This could drag on for years and cost you hundreds of thousands in legal fees. I understand, but I am not backing down. All right then, let me make some calls." If they want a fight, we will give them one. The following week was relatively quiet, which made me nervous. In my experience, quiet meant someone was planning something. Sure enough, on Thursday I received a notice that the HOA had filed a lawsuit against me, claiming my use of the trails constituted a private nuisance, and seeking an injunction to stop me from using them pending a full trial. Mark had expected this, and already had a response prepared. We filed a counter-suit for harassment, interference with property rights, and asked for damages for the vandalism and the chains that had blocked my access. The hearing for the injunction is set for next month, Mark told me. In the meantime, keep using the trails as normal. Document everything. If they try to interfere again, call the sheriff immediately. I followed his advice, riding the trails every weekend and maintaining them as I always had. But the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. People who used to wave as I rode by now either ignored me or glared. The HOA had apparently been very effective in painting me as the villain in this situation. The only bright spot was Jim Patterson, who made a point of stopping by every few days to show his support. He brought over dinner one night, his wife Martha's famous pot roast, and we sat in my living room talking about the old days before the development had taken over. "Your grandfather would be proud of you," Jim said. "Standing up for what is right even when it is hard." I hope so. Some days I wonder if I am just being stubborn. Stubborn and principled look a lot alike sometimes. The difference is whether you are doing it for yourself or for something bigger. You are fighting for something bigger. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. I kept running through everything in my mind, wondering if I had made the right choice. $2 million could have solved a lot of problems. But every time I thought about signing those easements away, I felt sick to my stomach. The hearing was held at the Crow Wing County Courthouse, an imposing stone building in Brainerd. Mark met me outside, carrying 2 large boxes of documentation. "We have got everything," he said confidently. "Property records, historical documents, maintenance logs, statements from people who use the trails. They have got nothing but complaints and speculation." Inside the courtroom, I saw Barbara and the entire HOA board sitting on the other side, along with Richard Hartley, and what looked like an army of lawyers in expensive suits. The judge, a stern-looking woman named Judge Patricia Morrison, took her seat and called the hearing to order. The HOA's lawyer, a slick guy named Preston Wells, presented their case first. He talked about noise complaints, environmental damage, and the need to protect the peaceful enjoyment of the neighborhood. He made me sound like some kind of reckless hooligan tearing through pristine wilderness with no regard for anyone else. Then, Mark stood up and methodically destroyed every argument. He presented the original easement documents from 1987, showing they had been properly recorded and renewed. He showed maintenance records proving I had been carefully managing the trails for environmental protection. He presented statements from the County Conservation Office praising my stewardship of the land. Then he dropped the bombshell. He showed that, when the development had been built, the trail easements had been explicitly disclosed in all the property sales. Every single homeowner had been informed of the easements before they bought their houses. Barbara and the board had known about them all along. "Your Honor," Mark said, "this is not about protecting the neighborhood. This is about a development company trying to eliminate legal property rights because those rights interfere with their expansion plans. The HOA board is nothing more than a proxy in this fight, funded by Northland Development Corporation to harass my client and intimidate him into giving up rights that have been legally established for almost 40 years. Preston Wells jumped up to object, but Judge Morrison waved him down. "I have heard enough," she said. The injunction is denied. Mr. Randall has clearly established his legal right to these easements. Furthermore, I am deeply troubled by the allegations of harassment and corporate manipulation of this HOA board. I am ordering both parties to mediation before this goes any further. Barbara looked like she was going to explode. Richard Hartley was stone-faced, but I could see the anger in his eyes. Mark was trying not to grin as we gathered our papers. Outside the courthouse, reporters from the local paper were waiting. Apparently, word had gotten out about the case, and it had become a story about property rights and corporate overreach. Mr. Randall, how do you feel about the judge's decision? A young reporter asked, shoving a microphone in my face. I am pleased that the judge recognized the facts of the case, I said carefully. These trails have been part of this community for decades. They represent responsible land use and conservation. I am glad the court sees their value. What do you say to accusations that you are standing in the way of community development? I say there is a difference between development and destruction. Real development works with existing resources and rights. It does not try to bulldoze over them. The story ran in the paper the next day, and suddenly public opinion started to shift. People who actually understood what was at stake started speaking up. Hunters and outdoor enthusiasts who used the trails began showing up at HOA meetings to voice their support for me. The County Conservation Board issued a statement praising the trail system and its importance to the area. The mediation session was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Mark advised me to go in with an open mind, but not to compromise on the core issue of the easements. They might offer money again, he said. Or they might try to negotiate some kind of limited access arrangement. But remember, you have the law on your side. You do not have to give up anything you do not want to. The mediation was held in a conference room at a local law office. Barbara and 3 other board members were there, along with Preston Wells and Richard Hartley. A professional mediator, a calm woman named Susan Chen, facilitated the discussion. Let us start by acknowledging what we agree on, Susan began. Both parties want what is best for the community. The question is how to balance property rights, community development, and environmental conservation. There is nothing to balance, I said. I have legal rights that have existed for 40 years. The HOA wants to take them away because a development company is paying them to do it. That is not true, Barbara snapped. We are trying to protect our neighborhood from noise and disruption. Then, why were you not complaining before Northland Development came along with their expansion plans? Mark asked. My client has been using these trails for 15 years. The complaints only started 6 months ago, which coincidentally is exactly when Northland began their planning process for the expansion. Richard Hartley leaned forward. Let us stop dancing around this. Mr. Randall, we are prepared to offer you $3 million for the easements. That is our final offer. And I am telling you again that they are not for sale. Then we have a problem, he said flatly, because that expansion is happening. We have already secured the property rights for the surrounding land. We have permits pending with the county. Your easements are the only thing standing in our way. Good. Maybe that will teach you to do your due diligence before you spend millions on land you cannot properly develop. The mediation lasted 4 hours and went nowhere. The HOA and Northland wanted the easements gone, and I was not budging. Finally, Susan called an end to the session. It appears we are at an impasse, she said. Unless someone is willing to compromise, this will have to be resolved in court. We will see you in court then, Preston Wells said, gathering his papers. As we left the building, Mark pulled me aside. They are going to come at you hard now. They tried money, they tried mediation, and now they will try to bury you in legal motions and make this so expensive and painful that you give up. I am not giving up, I know, but I need you to be prepared. This is going to get ugly. He was right. Over the next 3 months, Northland Development and the HOA threw everything they had at me. They filed motion after motion, challenging every aspect of the easements. They brought in expert witnesses to claim the trails were causing environmental damage. They hired private investigators to try to find something, anything, they could use against me. My legal bills started climbing into the tens of thousands. I had to take out a loan against my property just to keep up with the costs. There were days I wondered if I was being an idiot, throwing away my financial security for a principal. But then I would get a phone call from someone who used the trails, thanking me for fighting. Or I would see a family out snowmobiling, kids laughing as they rode through the snow. Or I would stand in the forest in the quiet of an early morning and remember why this mattered. The trial was finally scheduled for late spring. Mark and I spent weeks preparing, going over every document, every precedent, every angle of the case. He brought in his own expert witnesses, including a prominent land use attorney from Minneapolis and an environmental scientist who had studied the trail system. The trial lasted 3 days. The courtroom was packed with people from both sides. Barbara and the HOA board sat stone-faced through most of it. Richard Hartley was there every day, whispering instructions to his lawyers. Preston Wells presented their case with all the polish and rhetoric money could buy. He painted a picture of an outdated system of easements that no longer served the community's best interests. He talked about progress and growth and economic development. Then Mark stood up and presented the facts. He showed that the easements were legally sound, properly maintained, and served a vital community function. He demonstrated that Northland Development had known about the easements before they began their expansion plans, and had simply chosen to ignore them, hoping they could bully or buy their way through the problem. The environmental scientist testified that the trails were actually beneficial to conservation efforts, creating defined pathways that prevented people from wandering through sensitive areas. The land use attorney explained the importance of protecting established property rights, even when they were inconvenient for development. On the 3rd day, I took the stand. Preston Wells grilled me for 2 hours, trying to catch me in contradictions or make me look unreasonable. But I stuck to the truth. The trails were my grandfather's legacy. They served the community. They were legal and properly maintained. "Mr. Randall," Preston Wells said, his voice dripping with condescension, "is it not true that you could sell these easements for millions of dollars and end all of this?" "Yes." "So you are choosing to put this community through an expensive legal battle purely out of stubbornness?" "No, I am choosing to protect legal property rights and conservation efforts from a corporation that thinks it can buy or bully its way past the law. And if the court rules against you, then I will appeal, because this is not just about me. It is about whether property rights mean anything, or if they are just suggestions that can be ignored when enough money is involved." Judge Morrison called for closing arguments on the afternoon of the 3rd day. Both sides presented their final pitches, and then we waited while she reviewed the evidence. After a 2-hour recess, she returned to the bench. "I have reviewed all the evidence and arguments presented in this case," she began. "And I find that Mr. Randall's trail easements are legal, valid, and properly maintained. The HOA and Northland Development have failed to demonstrate any legal basis for having these easements dissolved or restricted." Barbara let out a small gasp. Richard Hartley's face turned red. "Furthermore," Judge Morrison continued, "I am troubled by the evidence suggesting that this lawsuit was brought in bad faith, funded by a development corporation to eliminate legal rights that were inconvenient to their business plans. I am awarding Mr. Randall his legal costs and fees to be paid jointly by the HOA and Northland Development Corporation. The courtroom erupted. People who had supported me cheered. The HOA board looked shell-shocked. Mark was grinning ear to ear, but Judge Morrison was not done. She banged her gavel for silence. I am also referring this matter to the county attorney for investigation into potential fraud and harassment charges. If it is determined that the HOA board knowingly brought false claims at the behest of a third party for financial gain, criminal charges may be appropriate. Now Barbara looked terrified. She leaned over and whispered frantically to Preston Wells, who looked nearly as panicked. After court adjourned, Mark and I stood outside while reporters peppered us with questions. I kept my answers simple and focused on the importance of protecting property rights and conservation. That night, I rode the trails alone, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The victory felt good, but more than that, it felt right. My grandfather would have been proud. The county attorney's investigation moved quickly once they started digging. It turned out that Barbara and 2 other board members had received significant payments from Northland Development Corporation that they had failed to disclose to the HOA membership. They had essentially been bribed to use HOA resources to fight a legal battle for the development company. 6 weeks after the trial, criminal charges were filed against Barbara and the 2 other board members for fraud, embezzlement of HOA funds, and criminal harassment. Richard Hartley and Northland Development were hit with civil charges for conspiracy and interference with property rights. The criminal trial was quick. Faced with overwhelming evidence, all 3 board members pleaded guilty in exchange for reduced sentences. Barbara received 6 months in jail and 3 years probation. The others got probation and community service. Northland Development settled the civil case out of court, paying me an additional $500,000 in damages, and agreeing to redesign their expansion to work around the existing trail easements. The Pinewood Estates HOA held emergency elections and installed a completely new board. One of their first acts was to pass a resolution officially recognizing and supporting the trail system. By the time summer arrived, things had finally calmed down. Jim Patterson and his wife Martha threw a big barbecue to celebrate, inviting everyone who had supported me throughout the fight. It felt good to see the community coming together, not divided by lawsuits and corporate manipulation. I used some of the settlement money to improve the trail system, adding better signage and upgrading some of the more worn sections. I also established a trust to ensure the trails would be maintained long after I was gone, so that future generations could enjoy them the way my grandfather had intended. One morning in July, I was doing maintenance on a section of trail when I heard a snowmobile approaching. It was too early in the season for that, so I was confused until I saw it was actually an ATV. Tom Anderson pulled up, grinning. "Thought I would check out the trail improvements," he said. "Looks great out here." "Thanks." I figured after everything we went through to keep them, I should make sure they are in the best shape possible. "You did a good thing, Owen. A lot of people would have taken that money and run. You stood up for something that mattered. It is what my grandfather would have wanted." These trails, they are not just about recreation. They are about connection to the land, about conservation, about keeping wild spaces accessible to regular people. "Speaking of which," Tom said, "the County Conservation Board wants to honor you at their annual dinner. They are giving you some kind of stewardship award. That is nice of them, but it is not necessary." "Too bad. You are getting it anyway. Besides, free dinner." Martha said she will come with you if you need a date, I laughed. Tell her I would be honored. As summer turned to fall and then to winter, life returned to normal. I rode the trails every weekend, waving to families and hunters and other outdoor enthusiasts. The HOA stopped causing problems, and Northland Development stayed far away from my property. On the first big snowfall of winter, I took my snowmobile out at dawn, just like I always had. The fresh snow was perfect, and the forest was silent except for the sound of my engine. I stopped at the ridge where my grandfather and I used to have lunch, looking out over the valley. I could almost hear his voice, telling me about the importance of stewardship and responsibility, about how land is not just something you own, but something you care for and pass on to the next generation. "I did it, Grandpa," I said quietly to the wind. "I kept the trails going. Just like you wanted." As I rode back home, the sun rising behind me, I felt a sense of peace I had not felt in months. The fight was over. The trails were safe, and my grandfather's legacy would continue for years to come. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw Jim Patterson waiting on my porch with 2 cups of coffee. "Figured you would be out early," he called. "Martha made cinnamon rolls. Thought you might want breakfast." "You are a good neighbor, Jim. Just returning the favor. You stood up for all of us, not just yourself. You showed people that property rights still mean something, that you can stand up to corporations and HOAs and win." "We won," I corrected. "All of us together." We sat on my porch in the cold morning air, drinking coffee and eating Martha's incredible cinnamon rolls, watching the sun climb higher in the winter sky. The trails stretched out behind my property, winding through the forest, connecting people to the land and to each other. It had been a hard fight, expensive and exhausting and stressful. But sitting there that morning, I knew without a doubt that it had been worth it. Some things are more important than money or convenience or avoiding conflict. Some things, like legacy and conservation and standing up for what is right, are worth fighting for no matter the cost. And as I sat there with my friend, looking out at the land my grandfather had loved and protected, I felt grateful for the chance to do the same. The trails were safe. The community was stronger. And somewhere, I like to think, my grandfather was smiling.